She stood at the edge of the combat field, the sun beating down on her back as sweat poured into her eyes, blurring her vision, but not enough to hide the wall that mocked her for the fourth time in a row. Her arms trembled, her legs quivered, and her breath came out in ragged gasps, yet no matter how much she pushed herself, she could not get over that obstacle. She had tried again and again, fingers scraping the rough wood nails, tearing skin raw, but every attempt ended the same. She slid, back down and landed in the dirt with a thud that echoed louder in her mind than in the ears of those who watched. The drill instructor barked her name, his voice like thunder shaking the field, calling her a failure again. His words lashed across. Her pride harsher than any whip. He told her she would never make it, told her she was wasting time, told her that warriors were born, not trained. And every recruit around her laughed or smirked or shook their heads, and the sting of humiliation burned. Hotter than the afternoon heat, still she did not answer. Still, she did not quit, because inside her chest, beneath all the doubt and shame, a single flame refused to die. She stumbled to the shooting range next mud, still clinging to her boots. Her hands, trembling as she lifted the rifle, but the target blurred. Her breathing was uneven, and with every shot, the instructor's marker tapped the clipboard with disappointment. 1 miss, 2 miss, 3 miss. And when the buzzer sounded, she knew, before he even shouted it, she had failed yet again. Her heart sank heavy, but she clenched her jaw, refusing to show the tears that stung her eyes. The next trial was the timed run across the obstacle course, the very thing that separated the strong from the weak, and as the whistle blew, she charged forward, determination burning across her face. But within seconds, the others had passed her. They scaled the nets, they rolled under the barbed wire, they launched over barriers while she struggled, stumbling, tripping, her lungs searing with fire as she fought for every step. And when she collapsed halfway, the whistle ended her agony and the laughter returned. She lay there, face pressed into the dirt, feeling its cold grit against her lips, her arms limp. Her spirit crushed. The instructor's voice echoed over her, telling the others that this was the example of failure, that this was what weakness looked like. And the recruits laughed again. Some whispered that she would be sent home. Others bet she would quit before the month ended. She heard it all, but deep inside, something resisted it. Something refused to bow. Later, as the sun began to fall and the field emptied of noise, she remained on the track alone, the bruises on her knees screaming. In protest, the blisters on her palms raw from rope burns, yet she forced herself up and ran, her legs heavy as chains dragging across the gravel, every step clumsy but defiant. She fell once, then twice, but each time she clawed her way up and staggered forward again, because giving up was not an option, not while she still had breath in her body. Night descended, and the lights from the barracks glowed in the distance. Recruits laughed and relaxed inside, but she stayed out running until her legs gave way, crawling across the mud until her arms quivered, unable to hold her weight. She whispered to herself that she would not be broken, that no matter how many times they mocked her, no matter how many failures she collected, she would rise again. She had to rise again, because she had something to prove, not to them, but to herself. Her thoughts drifted back to the day she first signed up, the looks on the faces of those who doubted her. The words of her family, telling her it was impossible, telling her she would not survive, telling her she was not built for this, and maybe they were right. Maybe she was not strong enough, but still she came, still she stood on this field, still she pushed through the pain, because something inside her screamed that she belonged here, that she could be forged into more. And so she dragged herself across the ground in the dark, the stars above silent witnesses to her struggle, her body trembling with exhaustion, her spirit hanging by a thread, yet refusing to snap. And though her scores that day had marked her as a failure, though the instructors had written her off, though her fellow recruits had mocked her, she knew something they did not know. She knew that failure was not the end failure. was the fuel that would carry her forward. As she finally collapsed flat on the dirt chest, heaving eyes closing against the burn of sweat, she whispered to herself that tomorrow she would rise again, tomorrow she would fight again, tomorrow she would prove them wrong, for no matter how many times the world called her weak, she was not done, not yet, not ever. The barracks grew quiet as night pressed heavy across the training grounds, yet she did not rest. Her body screamed for sleep, but her mind refused to surrender. She laced her boots once more and stepped out into the cold silence the field stretched. Before her, like a battlefield abandoned, but still waiting for her to prove something. Her lungs ached. Her muscles burned, yet she began to run 1 lap, 2 laps, 3 laps. The shadows of the obstacles looming like monsters in the dark, each one reminding her of failure, each one daring her to try again. She pushed herself harder, her feet slamming against gravel, her breath tearing out in ragged bursts, every step a battle against collapse. She stumbled more than once, catching herself on bleeding palms, her knees scraping raw against stone, but she forced herself forward, whispering to no one but herself that she would not quit. Not now. Not ever. She dragged her body to the rope wall. Her worst enemy staring down at her from above, she reached for it again, her blistered hands gripping the rough cord, her arms shaking violently as she pulled up, but her strength failed and she slipped crashing back into the dirt, her chest heaving, but still she rose again. Again she climbed again, she fell again. She tasted blood in her mouth from a split lip, but she roared in silence, forcing herself up the wall halfway 3/4, and then sliding down once more, the impact rattling her bones. She lay in the dirt, staring at the stars above her, every nerve screaming for mercy, but her heart refused to bow. She rolled onto her knees, her fists slamming into the ground, as she hissed to herself that she would beat this wall, that she would master it or break. Trying far across the field, lights flickered. A silhouette appeared watching her, though she could not see it yet. He stood arms crossed, a veteran whose eyes had witnessed war and fire, a Navy SEAL assigned to the camp. For a short time, he had seen many recruits, some strong, some weak, but something about her caught his eye, not her failures, but the way she refused to surrender. Despite the crushing weight of humiliation, she dragged herself forward when others would have quit. He saw in her not weakness, but raw, unshaped steel. She did not notice him as she crawled back to the track, beginning another run. Her breaths shallow, her vision blurred, yet she pushed forward like a wounded animal too stubborn to die. She stumbled again, and this time she collapsed hard, her face pressed into the dirt, her body shaking uncontrollably, sweat and tears mixing into the ground around her, the silence of the night swallowing her struggle. She almost stayed there, almost let the earth claim her, but something inside clawed upward and forced her back to her knees. She screamed without sound, forcing her body to rise again. The silhouette moved closer now, boots crunching softly on gravel, his shadow stretching across the ground until it fell over her broken frame. She froze when she sensed his presence, her heart thundering with shame, certain that another instructor had come to mock her or order her back to bed. She braced herself for the sting of harsh words, but none came instead. The shadow spoke low and steady, asking her why she kept fighting, when everyone else believed she would fail. She blinked through the sweat and dirt, lifting her head to stare at him, his stance firm, his presence overwhelming like a storm contained in human form. She wanted to answer, but no words came out, only ragged breaths. The SEAL studied her silently, then crouched to meet her eyes, his gaze piercing deep into the fear and anger that swirled inside her. And again he asked why she refused to quit, why she tortured herself in the night instead of giving up like the rest. Finally, her voice broke out, cracked and weak but full of fire. She told him she had to prove she belonged. She told him that failure had haunted her every day since she arrived, but that she would not let it define her. She told him she would rather collapse and never rise again than live with quitting. And for the first time, someone listened, truly. listened to her words without laughter, without doubt. The seal stood, and his presence seemed taller, stronger than any obstacle. On that field, he told her to meet him at dawn. If she truly wanted to change, he told her the training would not be official and it would not be easy. But if she was willing to endure, she could learn what it meant to fight like a warrior. Then he turned and walked away, his boots fading into the distance, leaving her trembling in the dirt, torn between fear and hope. She sat there staring after him, the cold air biting her skin, the stars above burning like silent witnesses to her choice. Her heart raced faster than ever, not from exhaustion, but from the weight of what had just been offered: a chance, a path, a test beyond the tests. She already knew she could barely stand, yet inside her chest, something ignited brighter than before. At dawn, she would stand before him. At dawn, she would accept whatever hell he had planned, and at dawn she would either rise or break. But she knew one thing with certainty: she would not run, she would not hide. She would face it, because this was her last chance to transform her failures into fire, and she would seize it. The first light of dawn crept across the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of fire and ash, and she stood on the training field trembling, but ready, her boots heavy with mud, her uniform soaked in sweat from the night before, her body bruised and battered, yet her eyes locked forward with a stubborn fire. She did not know what awaited her, only that the Navy SEAL would arrive, and that his challenge would decide if she belonged or if she would forever remain the shadow of a soldier. He appeared. Without fanfare, no shouted orders, no commanding presence that demanded obedience. Instead, he moved with quiet authority. Every step measured his face, carved by years of war, his eyes sharp and cold. He stopped a few feet from her and studied her. Without a word, the silence stretched until it pressed on her chest, heavier than any obstacle. Then he asked her with a voice low and steady if she was ready to endure something far worse than the drills that had already broken her. Her mouth was dry, but she nodded. She did not trust her voice. He circled her like a predator gauging prey and then spoke again. He told her this training was not for recruits. This was not in the manuals or the schedules. This was private, brutal, and unforgiving. If she wanted to quit now, she could walk away and no one would ever know. But if she stayed, she would wish for death before she earned respect. The words struck deep into her bones, but instead of fear, they sparked defiance. She clenched her fists and said she was ready, though. Her voice cracked. He gave a single nod, then pointed toward the ground, telling her to drop and begin push-ups. She obeyed, her arms burning after 10, after 20, after 30, and when her chest slammed into the dirt, unable to rise again, he crouched close and told her this was only the beginning. He ordered her up, dragging her to her feet, and sent her running across the field with a pack weighed down heavier than anything she had carried before the straps cut. Into her shoulders, her lungs screamed for air, but every time she slowed, he appeared beside her, his voice cutting through the dawn, commanding her to keep moving. She stumbled and fell more than once, but each time he stood over her, refusing to let her stay down, his presence alone enough to force her back to her feet. Hours bled together. Sweat poured down her body, and her legs threatened to collapse beneath her weight. But the SEAL did not relent. He forced her into crawling under barbed wire, her elbows scraping against gravel, blood streaking her skin when she paused. He shouted for her to move faster when she cried out from pain. He told her the battlefield did not care for tears. Her body trembled, her vision blurred, but his words carved into her mind. Pain is weakness. Leaving you pain is proof you are alive. She wanted to hate him. She wanted to curse him. But something inside her understood that every brutal demand was a hammer striking against the fragile shell she had carried with her since day one, and slowly cracks began to form, revealing something harder beneath when he dragged her to the rope wall she once feared and ordered her to climb. She looked at it not as an enemy but as a challenge. She clawed at the rope, with bloodied hands, her muscles screaming, but this time she climbed higher. Her breath ragged, her body shaking, but she refused to let go until she touched the top. When she slid back down, exhausted, she expected disappointment. But instead, the seal gave the faintest nod of approval. It was not praise, it was not comfort, but it was something, and that something lit a fire inside her hotter than any humiliation had ever done. He ordered her up again and again, the training relentless until the sun rose high and the field shimmered with heat. By the time he called a halt, she was collapsed on the dirt, her chest heaving. Her body soaked in sweat and blood, her arms trembling too weak to lift. She thought she might pass out, but then he crouched beside her again, his shadow falling across her face, and he asked her if she understood. Now she looked at him, confused, barely able to breathe. He told her she was learning what it meant to suffer, what it meant to strip away weakness, what it meant to earn strength. She lay there unable to answer, but she felt something stir inside her, a realization that perhaps for the first time, she was no longer simply failing. She was transforming. He stood and told her to return again the next dawn, the words. Not a request, but a command. Then he walked away, his presence vanishing into the distance, leaving her broken but not defeated. She rolled onto her back, staring at the vast sky above the clouds drifting slowly across the blue, and she felt a strange calm settle over her despite the pain, despite the bruises, despite the exhaustion. She felt alive in a way she never had before. And as the wind whispered across the field, she knew that tomorrow she would come back. Tomorrow she would endure. Again tomorrow she would rise because she was no longer just fighting to pass a test. She was fighting to become something greater than herself. The next dawn broke cold and gray clouds gathered across the horizon like a warning, and she stood once more at the center of the training field, her body bruised, her muscles aching from the day before, yet her eyes fixed forward with the same fire that had carried her through the night. The seal appeared again without sound. His steps measured his gaze unreadable. He said nothing at first, only studied her as though weighing her resolve. Then he ordered her to follow and led her to a section of the grounds rarely used by recruits. A place where broken equipment lay rusting and the earth was uneven. He stopped and turned to her, his voice calm but sharp as steel. Today, he said, you will learn the truth of combat today. You will discover whether your body or your will rules you. And if your will breaks, you will leave this field knowing you were never meant to be here. She swallowed hard but nodded, determined not to show the fear that churned in her chest. He strapped a weighted vest on her shoulders heavier than anything she had carried before and ordered her to run. The ground was uneven rocks and mud, slowing her every step. The vest cut into her shoulders like knives. Each breath dragged fire through her lungs, and the seal followed close behind, his voice striking like a whip. Every time she faltered, he reminded her that hesitation in combat meant death, that hesitation meant failure for everyone beside her. She stumbled again and again, but each time she hit the ground. He forced her up, pushing her forward until her legs felt like shattered stone. When at last he called her to halt, she collapsed to her knees, gasping for air, her chest burning, but there was no time for rest. He tossed a wooden rifle at her feet and ordered her to crawl under the barbed wire. She obeyed, dragging herself forward, elbows and knees scraping across sharp gravel, her uniform tearing skin raw each time she slowed. The rifle was yanked from her hands and slammed into the dirt. Beside her, his voice thundered through the morning, telling her a soldier who drops her weapon dies with it, blood mixed with dirt on her arms, but she kept crawling, refusing to let go of the rifle, her teeth clenched against the pain, the wire above. Her snagged at her back, shredding fabric, but she moved faster, every inch earned with rage and grit. When she finally emerged on the other side, her arms shook uncontrollably, yet she held the rifle close to her chest. The seal gave a single nod, then pointed to the rope wall. Her heart pounded. She remembered every failure, every slip, every humiliating fall. But she also remembered the fire that had driven her higher. Yesterday, she leapt at the rope, gripping with blistered hands, dragging her body. Upward, her arms screamed. Her legs trembled, but she pushed higher. One pull, another pull, the top growing closer. She thought she would fall, but when her grip slipped, she roared in defiance, forcing her body upward until her hand slapped the beam. At the top, she slid down, exhausted yet victorious. The seal's stare locked on her with approval, so faint she almost doubted it. The training did not end. He led her into the woods beyond the field where the ground turned slick with mud and roots tangled. Underfoot, he blindfolded her and placed the rifle back in her hands. His voice steady and low, now telling her that sight could not always be trusted, that panic in the dark could kill faster than bullets. Then he ordered her to move forward blind and silent. At first, every step was chaos. Her foot catching roots, her body crashing into branches. But his voice stopped her each time, telling her to slow, telling her to breathe, telling her to listen to the ground beneath her boots, the wind against, her face the weight of the rifle in her hands. Slowly, she began to trust her other senses. Slowly, she moved smoother, quieter, more controlled. She stumbled still, but each mistake burned less, and every correction etched deeper into her mind when at last he removed the blindfold. She stood taller, steadier, as though she had been remade in silence. The hours stretched on the tasks relentless, dragging her beyond exhaustion, into something raw and new. He forced her to run again. He forced her to crawl again. He forced her to climb until her arms felt carved from fire and her legs from stone. And when she finally collapsed, unable to rise, he crouched beside her and whispered that this was the point where most broke, that this was the place where weakness begged for mercy, but that she had to choose if she would listen to weakness or silence it forever. She stared at the dirt, her body trembling, her vision swimming with exhaustion. Every part of her wanted to quit, but the voice inside, her, the flame that had carried her through every failure, screamed louder than her pain. She slammed her fists into the ground and dragged herself up, standing on shaking legs, rifle still in hand, sweat and blood streaking her face, but her eyes unyielding. The seal gave the faintest smile before it vanished into his hard expression. When the sun dipped low and the shadows stretched across the field, he finally called a halt. She collapsed onto the ground, every nerve screaming, yet inside her chest burned. Steady fire, she was stronger than she had ever been. Not because she conquered the training, but because she had not surrendered to it. As she lay there staring at the darkening sky, she knew the seal would push harder tomorrow. She knew the pain would grow worse. But she also knew she would return because quitting was no longer an option. The night fell heavy and cold shadows stretched across the camp, while most recruits slept safe in their bunks. But she stood again on the edge of the field, summoned by the seal, his orders sharp and unyielding. There would be no rest, he said not. Tonight, not ever, for those who chose the path of warriors. She followed him into the darkness. Her legs still bruised, her arms still burning, yet her spirit burning hotter than her wounds. He led her to a pit filled with mud, thick and foul the stench, rising like rot. He told her to get in. She hesitated only a second before plunging down the cold mud. Swallowing her to the waist, he ordered her to crawl forward, rifle in hand, and keep the barrel dry every inch. Was agony the mud dragged at her. Body sucking her down her muscles, screaming as she fought to move the rifle, slipping from her hands more than once. But each time she recovered it, clutching it like life itself. His voice cut through the night, warning her that if her weapon drowned, she drowned with it. She emerged, filthy, gasping, shivering, but he gave no pause. He dragged her to the next challenge, a trench filled with icy water, and told her to hold her breath and submerge until his command. Her heart thundered. She had always feared the water, but she clenched her teeth and sank beneath the surface, cold stabbing her chest, lungs screaming for air, time stretched, endless darkness pressing in. Panic clawed at her mind, telling her to rise, but she forced herself down deeper, fighting the instinct to quit. until at last his hand yanked her back to the surface. She coughed and gagged, but she was still alive. The seal stared at her, his expression unreadable, and told her that panic was the greatest enemy that fear killed. Faster than bullets, he ordered her to go again and again. She obeyed, each time her lungs begging for relief, each time the darkness pulling at her. But each time she returned stronger, refusing to break, when at last he let her climb out. She was shaking, but her eyes no longer looked the same. They carried a cold fire that had not been there before. He did not relent. He blindfolded her once more and placed her in the woods, commanding her to move silently like a ghost through the trees. Every crack of a twig, every stumble against a root earned a strike from a stick across her back. He told her enemies would hear the slightest sound. He told her silence was survival. She learned quickly to breathe softer, to step lighter, to listen to the world. Around her, her heart no longer pounded with panic, but with focus. Hours bled away until exhaustion blurred her thoughts. Yet still, he pressed her farther. He ordered her to fight him hand to hand in the dirt. No rules, no mercy. At first, she was overwhelmed. Thrown again and again into the ground, her body aching with every impact. But he forced her up each time, demanding she strike back, demanding she claw and kick and resist until her body responded on instinct, until her fists found their mark, until her breath grew steady even as her ribs screamed with pain. He pinned her to the ground one last time, then released her and told her she was no longer a recruit. Learning drills, she was a fighter. Learning survival. The night deepened the stars high. Above and still, he tested her mind as much as her body. He sat her in the dirt, shivering, and told her to speak of her failures, every one of them. She hesitated, ashamed. But he demanded louder, forcing her to face them, forcing her to rip them open, until she shouted every humiliation, every doubt, every voice that told her she could not. He listened in silence, then told her that these failures were no longer chains. They were fuel. They were scars that proved she endured. When the first edge of dawn began to glow across the horizon, she was half broken, her body trembling too much to stand, her throat raw, her hands cut and swollen, yet she felt something inside, that no pain could touch, a strength carved from the night, a fire forged from fear. He crouched before her one last time and said, "The weak fear the dark, but warriors are born in it." Then he stood and left her there with nothing but her breath and the rising sun. She collapsed into the dirt, her body too heavy to move her chest, heaving with exhaustion. But her lips curved into the faintest smile. She had survived the night. She had faced the cold and the dark and her own fears. And still she was here. And as the light spilled across the field, she knew with certainty she would rise again. She would face whatever came next, because she was no longer the same broken recruit who once failed every test. She was something else now, something harder, sharper, forged by the seal's relentless fire. The morning of the combat test arrived, the air thick with tension as recruits lined up across the field, the instructors' eyes sharp and unforgiving, the same wall, the same rope, the same range stood waiting like executioners. Every memory of failure clawed at her mind, but this time her chest rose steady, her fists clenched with purpose. She was not the same broken shadow who had stumbled before. She had been dragged through darkness, through mud, through fire, and each scar across her body reminded her she had already survived worse than anything this test could give. The whistle pierced the air and they surged forward, bodies slamming against obstacles, mud-flying voices shouting orders and curses, but she moved with silent focus every step. Measured every breath controlled. When the wall loomed, she leapt for the rope, her blistered hands gripping firm. She hauled herself up, muscles burning but steady, one pull, two pulls, and before she realized it, she had reached the top, her chest pressed. Against the beam, she stared for a heartbeat, stunned, then roared as she swung over and dropped down the other side, the instructors scribbling furiously on their boards. The course twisted ahead, barbed wire glinting with dew. She dropped low and crawled. Rifle in hand, every scrape of gravel cutting into her arms, but she moved with the ghost-like silence the seal had beaten into her. No hesitation, no wasted breath. The other recruits flailed beside her, their weapons dragging in the dirt, but she emerged. Fast and clean rifle still tight in her grip. The shooting range came next, her greatest humiliation in the past. The targets lined up ahead, staring back like silent enemies. Her hands tightened on the weapon. Her breathing slowed. She heard the seal's voice echo inside her head. Do not fear the shot. Fear hesitation. She raised the rifle sight. A lined squeeze. Do not jerk. The first target dropped, then the second, then the third. A rhythm steady, precise. Each shot striking clean, the sound echoing across the field until the range officer himself paused and stared. She sprinted to the next obstacle. The cargo net swaying high above the ground. Recruits hesitated at the climb. Some faltered, but she lunged upward, her arms and legs moving like pistons, her breath steady. She reached the top, her mind blank, except for forward, 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 and slid down the far side without pause when her boots hit the ground. She surged on the instructors, watching with narrowed eyes as though trying to catch her in weakness. Her legs screamed fire. Her lungs begged for rest. But she drove harder than ever before every ounce of pain drowned beneath the roar of her will. When the final sprint came, she unleashed everything, her boots pounding the earth faster, 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 until the finish line rose before her, and she crossed it in a blur, chest heaving, heart raging, eyes blazing. For a moment, there was silence, complete and crushing. The recruits who once mocked her stood wide-eyed, their mouths half open. The instructors stared down at their clipboards as though uncertain whether the numbers written there were real. She stood at attention, every muscle trembling but her back straight. Her gaze forward, she would not show weakness. Not now. Not when she had bled to reach this moment. The drill instructor barked her name, his voice different, now harder, but carrying something new, respect. He announced her score, and it hung in the air like a thunderclap above standard, faster than most. Cleaner than many, she had not only passed, she had outperformed nearly the entire line. The whispers started low among the recruits, spreading like wildfire. How had she done it when she had failed every test before? How had the weakest become one? Of the strongest, she said nothing. She did not smile. She did not celebrate. She only stood breathing, steady, her eyes lifting to the horizon, because she knew the truth. This victory was not the end. It was a single battle won, the war for strength, never ended. And somewhere watching from the shadows, the seal stood unseen. Arms crossed, his face unreadable, but a faint nod of approval flickered before he turned and vanished, leaving her to face the storm of disbelief alone. The instructors dismissed. The group and the recruits scattered, some still whispering, some glaring with envy, others avoiding her entirely. But she walked forward alone. Silent, steady, the mud on her boots, the blood on her hands. Nothing compared to the fire in her chest. She had faced the test that once crushed her, and risen above it. And though they might never know how she carried the truth with her, she carried the voice of the seal, his lessons etched into every breath. As the sun climbed higher, she found herself alone on the track once more, the empty field stretching wide and quiet. She dropped to her knees, pressing her palms into the dirt, feeling its grit, its weight, its permanence, and she whispered to herself that this was only the beginning, that the path of a warrior had no finish line, only steps forward, each one harder than the last. She rose again, despite the ache, despite the exhaustion, because tomorrow she knew the seal would come again. Tomorrow the training would grow harsher, and she would meet it without fear. The camp buzzed with whispers long after the combat test ended. Her name carried through the barracks, through the mess hall, through every corner like a rumor no one could ignore. Recruits who once mocked her now stared from the corners of their eyes some in awe, some in jealousy, some in quiet fear. The instructors spoke less loudly around her, their usual smirks replaced with silence, as though uncertain how to address what they had seen, and though she felt their gazes burn into her, she showed no reaction. Her face steady, her stride calm. She had no interest in their opinions anymore, for her war was no longer with them. It was with herself. That night, when the others slept, she returned to the field, the scars of the day still raw. Across her body, but her spirit unwilling to rest, she began to run the track, her boots slamming against gravel, the moonlight guiding her, and she thought she was alone until a shadow moved beside her, the seal emerging from the darkness as if he had been waiting. His presence carried no surprise, now only inevitability. She slowed, but he barked for her to keep running, and she obeyed, legs screaming yet carrying her forward. After several laps, he ordered her to halt. She staggered, gasping for breath, and he studied her in silence, then asked her what she thought she had proven. Today she hesitated, unsure whether to speak of the score or the victory, but he cut her off before she answered, telling her that the test meant nothing, that scores meant nothing, that she had proven nothing until she could face combat, not drills, not courses, but combat. Her chest tightened at his words, but she did not back away. She asked him what he wanted her to do, and his lips curved in the faintest of smiles, before hardening again. He led her into the woods away from camp, deeper than before, where the trees closed in and the ground turned uneven. He told her tonight would be the real test. He told her tonight she would fight not for score, not for pride, but for survival. Then he disappeared into the darkness, leaving her alone, heart hammering in her chest. She gripped the training rifle tighter, her eyes scanning the shifting shadows, every sound magnified by her fear. A twig snapped to her left, and she spun, raising the rifle, but too late the seal lunged from the darkness, knocking her flat. His weight crushing down his voice, cold telling her she was dead, he ordered her up again and vanished. She staggered to her feet, panting, sweat dripping. Down her face she spun, searching the shadows. Another rustle this time behind her. She turned faster, raising the rifle, and blocked his strike with the stock. The impact rattled her arms, but she did not fall. He smiled briefly before vanishing once more. The night turned into a battlefield. She stumbled through the woods, every branch a threat, every shadow a weapon. The seal struck again and again from angles unseen, throwing her to the ground, pinning her, disarming her, forcing her to scramble. Back to her feet, she bled from scratches. She gasped from exhaustion, but each time she rose faster, each time she blocked sooner, each time her counterstrike grew sharper, the fire in her chest burning brighter with every fall. At last she caught him. Off guard, his hand, striking for her shoulder as he always had, but this time she twisted her body, drove her elbow into his side, and forced him back a step. She followed with a strike of the rifle butt, aimed for his chest, but he caught it just before. It landed, their eyes locking in the moonlight. His grip iron, his face unreadable, yet behind his gaze flickered something she had not seen before recognition. He shoved her back hard enough to send her stumbling but not falling. Then he raised his hand, calling a halt. She froze, panting, her chest heaving, her arms trembling, but her eyes burning with unyielding fire. He studied her for a long moment before speaking, and when he did, his words cut through the night like steel. He told her she had finally crossed the line between a recruit and a warrior, that she had faced fear and refused to bow, that she had faced pain and refused to break. Her body sagged with exhaustion, but her spirit soared with a quiet triumph. His approval was not praise, but it was more than enough. He turned then and began to walk back toward the camp. She followed, limping but unyielding. When they emerged from the trees, the first light of dawn began to creep across the horizon, casting the world in shades of fire. She realized how far she had come from the girl who once failed every test. As they parted ways, he paused for only a moment and gave a final nod before disappearing into the barracks, leaving her alone in the fading shadows. She stood watching the sun rise, her chest heaving, her body aching, yet her heart unshakable. She had fought through the night against more than just his strikes. She had fought against her old self, against weakness, against fear, and she had won. She knew now that nothing could silence the fire within her, not the laughter of recruits, not the doubt of instructors, not the obstacles that once humiliated her. She had become something more, forged by darkness, sharpened by pain, and though the path ahead promised only more battles, she was ready. She would never again be the girl who failed every combat test. She was reborn as a warrior, and the world would learn her name through scars and fire. The dawn spilled across the camp, painting the horizon in crimson gold. The recruits gathered for morning drill. But their chatter shifted the moment she stepped into view. They had seen her victory yesterday, and the whispers had already grown into something sharper. Some watched with respect, others with envy, but none with the contempt. They once carried her presence, no longer weak, no longer uncertain. She walked among them, silent but strong. Her eyes focused, her stride unbroken, as if she carried something they could not understand. The instructors called them to order, voices booming across the field. Yet when they reached her name, they hesitated a heartbeat before continuing, their tone heavier than before. Not softer, but changed the smallest. Edge of recognition laced through the commands. And though no one said it aloud, the entire line of recruits could feel the difference. She had shifted something in the air, something none of them could deny. The drills began, endless running push-ups, crawling through gravel and mud. Yet she moved through them with a steady rhythm, each repetition fueled by a deeper strength than muscle. The others began to falter one by one, but she endured. Her body battered, her lungs burning, her arms quivering. Yet she endured. The instructor's eyes flicked toward her again and again, as though trying to break her with stares alone. But she did not falter. She did not look away. She was not theirs to crush anymore. She belonged to no one but the fire inside her. By midday, when the sun burned high, the recruits collapsed in shade. But she remained on the field, drenched in sweat, knees shaking, still pushing herself. The instructors told her to stand down, but she shook her head and pushed harder. And from the shadows, as if drawn by her defiance, the seal appeared once more, silent as stone, his eyes fixed on her alone. He said nothing at first, simply watching her drive herself to the edge, and only when she collapsed into the dirt did he finally step forward. His voice low, yet carrying through the stillness. He told her the training was over. His lessons complete. She had endured enough. She had fought enough. She had become something unbreakable. She tried to rise, to argue, to say there was more, to learn. But he silenced her with a single look and said, "The hardest truth. The warrior path never ends, but the warrior walks it alone." His duty was to forge her into someone who could face the path without him, and now she was ready. Her chest tightened, not from exhaustion but from the weight of his words. She asked if he would leave her now, if she would never see him again. His silence answered before his lips did. He told her warriors never truly leave. They remain in the lessons, in the scars. In the fire, they leave behind. Then he turned his back on her and began to walk away, his boots striking the earth with finality. She staggered to her feet, aching, bleeding, yet unwilling to let him vanish. Without understanding, she called out, asking why he had chosen her, why he had given his time to someone who had failed so many times when others were stronger, faster, sharper. He paused for only a moment, his shoulders still, his head tilted slightly. Then he spoke without turning back. He said, "He chose her because failure is the greatest forge, because the ones who rise from ashes burn brighter than those who never fall." Then he continued walking until the shadows swallowed him completely. She stood frozen, the weight of his words pressing. Into her soul, the recruits watched from the edges, uncertain whether to step closer or keep their distance. The instructors shouted for them to return to drill, but all eyes lingered on her as she stood alone in the middle of the field, her hands trembling, her chest heaving, her spirit aflame. From that day forward, everything shifted. Her name whispered in barracks with awe. Her presence in training no longer mocked, but respected, even feared. She drove herself harder each sunrise, each nightfall, carrying the unseen weight of the SEAL's teachings. Every bruise, every scar became her scripture, every obstacle her altar. She no longer measured herself against scores or against others. She measured herself only against the silence in her chest, the demand to rise again and again. Weeks passed, and when the final evaluations came, she faced them with the same calm fire. The tests brutal, the drills merciless, yet none broke her. Her body moved like a blade honed through countless strikes, her mind locked in unyielding focus. And when the last bell rang, she stood at the front of her class, her name carved into the roll of those who passed, not just passed, but excelled. The instructors offered no easy praise, but in their clipped nods and quiet tones. She felt it. She had earned their recognition. On the night of graduation, while the others celebrated in barracks, she slipped away to the quiet edge of the camp, where the trees stood dark and silent. She stared into the shadows, half expecting to see him emerge once more, half longing, half fearing. But the forest gave her only silence. Yet within that silence, she felt him still, every lesson etched into her bones, every word echoing through her heart. She whispered a promise to the night, that she would not waste what he had given her, that she would carry it into every battle, into every storm, into every impossible moment, that she would honor the fire he had lit by never letting it die. Then she stood, tall, eyes fixed on the horizon, where her path stretched endless and uncertain. She was no longer the girl who failed every combat test. She was the warrior the SEAL had seen hidden beneath the ashes, and though he was gone, she knew he was with her, in every breath, in every step. In every strike, the warrior path had no finish line. Only the next fight, and she was ready. She would never walk it in weakness again.